Okay, thanks very much, everybody, and welcome to seminar number 4 of the AARE seminar series, which Amanda and myself have been curating kind of in lieu of us not being able to put on a national conference this year. I just want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting today on many lands, and in particular to acknowledge that I live and work on the land that's been cared for millennia by the Yagara, Yugara and Yugarabal peoples of Ipswich. It's our great pleasure to have Professor Rob Hattam this afternoon, who's going to be presenting today's seminar. And one thing that we'd like to encourage people who are on Twitter is if you wish to kind of tweet some of the more juicy bits of Rob's talk, please feel free to use the hashtag AARE seminars. So Rob is a professor at the University of South Australia in the Education Futures, and he's the convener of the Pedagogies for Justice Research Group. Today he's going to be talking to us about something that in the lead up before we began the session, he told Amanda and I he's been busting to talk about this stuff for months now. And so we're very interested to hear what he has to say about moving towards a politics of truth for schooling in Australia. We are recording this session and it will be made available on the AARE website for members, but just to let folks know that once Rob finishes the presentation part, I will stop the recording and invite people to engage with Rob in some conversation. So over to you, Rob.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stuart and Amanda. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture. I hope that decision turns out to be a good thing. I'd like to say hello to my friends. I'm assuming that it's my friends that are listening. I hope I don't disappoint. Anyway, here we go. So I too would like to acknowledge the elders and families and descendants of the Galna people. It's the country that I'm talking from. And for those people who don't know South Australia, I've got a little map up there. And normally when we have these acknowledgements, we are acknowledging the elders. And just as a sort of a segue to my paper, I think when we're acknowledging elders of an Indigenous nations, one of the things we're doing is we're sort of acknowledging the sort of knowledge and wisdom systems that sort of historically have been organised by those communities, and over this case, over tens of thousands of years. But anyone who's paying attention to Indigenous struggle in our country and across the settler colonial countries will realise that the sort of Indigenous knowledge systems are basically disqualified by sort of Western settler colonial knowledge systems. And so I think what we have here is a wonderful example of a politics of truth that's played out actually. And so the sort of colonising projects actually organised through the way that truth is organised. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that I think that at the moment, educators are being disqualified by a politics of truth in our space. And I derive a lot of inspiration from Indigenous struggle in that space. Anyway, let's zoom on here. Here was the invite that Stewie sent me, and he wanted me to be reflective, provocative, conceptual, empirical, and so on. I've tried to be all of those actually. And I suppose in some ways I just wanted to a preamble for my presentation is it's a thought experiment, to be sort of philosophical for a moment. The sort of main moves in my presentation, I've got a thesis that I want to give in the first part of it, and basically my thesis goes in the middle of the failing policy regime for Australian schooling is a science war. Governing asserts truth through science, that then educational policy truths are now framed up inside of a what works logic that disqualifies other knowledges. That's the basic thesis. And I think this is nothing unusual, but I just want to say it plainly for myself. And then I sort of summarise the failure on 2 counts and to draw out some issues around the nature of the failure for me. We're sort of intensifying the social stratifying function of schooling. And we're also undermining the professional autonomy of teachers. And so I'm making an argument in the front half of the paper that there's a policy dissonance between educators' knowledge and the policy, but also there's another dimension to the dissonance. And I want to pick up on my argument and argue for a shift to reclaim an alternative archive of evidence, because that's what I think is at stake here, is what counts as evidence, and also to be working with the practical wisdom of teachers. And as a sort of quick sketch to outline some work that I've been doing for years that I think sort of represents the sort of alternative archive. And then in the last couple of slides to push for imagining a knowledge producing school. Okay. I suppose the first half of my paper, we are talking about science, and just to ensure that I'm very clear here, is I am arguing for science. I think this is quite clear. It's just that I think as the presentation unfolds, I want to ask some questions about how we understand science. I can't help myself. I got this sent to me the other day. I think this is again. I told Stu I wasn't going to swear, so I won't read the title here. Just a way of getting started. I've just come off a sabbatical, so I can't complain about my life. And I spent about 2 or 3 months going rereading my Foucault archive for various reasons, and I am just going to drop a few Foucault quotes in just for fun. And so, what the Foucault? Maybe the presentation is also framed up by a quote from the second essay in Foucault's book, The Politics of Truth, in his essay called What is Critique? So maybe the whole argument's framed up around how not to be governed like that, by that, in the name of those principles with such and such an objective in mind, and by means of such procedures, not like that, nor for that, not by them. I think that's the basic argument. Just some quick moments before we jump into sort of education policy issues. You know, a few things that are going on at the moment that I think are very, very important that I just need to mention very quickly. We're sort of living in a time of intensifying market deregulation. We've got an explosion of economic inequality. We've got mainstreaming of neo-racism and white supremacy and ethno-nationalist discourses, and we hear a lot of blaming of the others. We've got an intensifying of a sort of post-truth reality, which sort of vacillates between lying and just denying science fundamentally. And amongst all of that, there's quite clear that there's de-democratizing tendencies going on in our societies with a shift towards authoritarian governing. That's a lot, isn't it? Anyway, we can see sort of examples of rising economic inequality. We've even got treasurers saying that inequality is not the role of government. We've got our politicians voting for it's okay to be white. I mean, we can have many, many references here. And then, of course, we needed to stroke the Donald Trump post-truth moment, but he's just sort of an exemplar of something much, much larger. To start my sort of basic argument, I'm saying that teachers are now being fitted up with the truth of good practice as defined by the germ, the Solberg's global education reform movements, you know, code for you know, the regime. I'm calling it a regime of truth that now operates as a global orthodoxy in education policy. And unfortunately, in Australia today, that reform agenda is increasingly under duress. Now, the regime of truth, and by way of shorthand, we can refer to this as the germ, is an assemblage of neoliberalising policy diktats and a version of educational science framed up by what works. Being fitted up by the truth, I got this email from one of my students a few years ago, which is sort of an exemplar of how the fit up is experienced by young teachers working in schools. And just to read this out, funnily enough, working with the State Education Department, the ACER are kind of like gospel. I'm still adjusting to the fact that I can have an actual opinion when I've got my university student hat on. This is from a teacher who's been teaching for 7 years. It's incredibly liberating. Yet having been exposed to the governmental restrictions for so long as I have, it's somewhat debilitating too. Now that's sort of a disturbing quotation. It gives a sort of a reading of you know, how the regime of truth sort of working on teachers. A quote from Foucault: every society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the types of discourse which it accepts and functions as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, the means by which by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedures accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. So I guess that's how his understanding of politics of truth fundamentally. We can have some references for the germ. There's many things here. I've just got in the yellow section, you know, some quotations. We're probably all familiar with that. Here's my attempt to put the germ into a sort of a neat diagram. I'm saying it's an assemblage of neoliberalism and the what works movement. So we have sort of axioms of neoliberalising and educational science, with science in inverted commas. And we could put a lot of dot points for the neoliberalising, but let's just go with a sort of universalisation of market-based social relations, a shift towards, we're all being positioned as being autonomous and responsible for everything. We've got deregulation of governance, and if we push it further, then we've got a transformation of values, a transformation of structures, formation of new subjectivities, in which case our compliance is literally internalised. When we come over to the sort of educational science side, there's many words that we can put up there. There's been 20 or 30 years critique of school effectiveness and school improvement. I think that's one way we could name it up. Many people that I read talk about the what works paradigm. That's the one I want to use today. But we've also got in our country anyway, a particular narrow version of learning science, or people claiming learning science, and as being the ones that get invited into the policy spaces. So again, a quote from Lemke, who's sort of a famous Foucault scholar, in terms of the way that he wants to understand neoliberalism, an attempt to redefine the social sphere as a form of the economic domain. I think that's sort of the neatest definition one can have for neoliberalising. In terms of the what works logic, when I try and get my ideas onto a t-shirt sometimes. So for me, the what works discourse renders down to, here's the truth, just do it. And that seems to me to be how the sort of learning sciences discourse is working on teachers at the moment. I went looking for some graphics for this, and here's from the Victorian Education Department's website. So here's evidence-based high-impact teaching strategies. This is the advice to its teachers. So I'm just give you an example of the discourse, the what works discourse. If you keep on going, then here's the next. You know, you scroll down on the website. So evidence-based education is an approach. It aims to apply the best available evidence gained from scientific methods. While every school is at a different stage of development, there is a substantive evidence base about the common strategy. So in one dot point, we can put context to one side and go for some generalisable claims. There's a number of strategies that have been found to have high impact on student learning. Do you get? I mean, you can find the sort of basic logic of the what works on too many departmental websites, I'd be arguing. And it's all just sort of normalised. I just wanted to go for you know, one of the key exemplars of the what works discourse. And here's an ad from a workshop by the Visible Learning people. I just read out the text. Professor John Hattie and the Visible Learning team know about the learning strategies that have the greatest impact on learners. They know what works. From attending this symposium, you'll be able to use the evidence to plan effective learning. There is a science of learning, and we find out more and more about what works best to support the learning processes. Can you see the sort of the way that this argument's being put out? Now, my critique of this very quickly, and we could have spent the whole time going after this, but just for the benefit of something quick, as far as I can see, this is sort of positivist decontextualised knowledge that purports a disembodied objectivity. It's sort of a one-size-fits-all approach that fails to acknowledge context. The researchers that present this knowledge present themselves as outside of circuits of power and knowledge themselves. They play the God trick, that is, they see everything from nowhere. We don't learn anything about what's going on in actually existing schools, or about the actual existing pedagogical challenges of real teachers. It's not even framed up in those ways. And the policy insiders offer no conceptual resources for critique. It's all about, here's the answer. And I can go on. I've got another page here. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. This mob haven't read the philosophy or the history of science, nor the demands to decolonise knowledge systems. They completely ignore the politics of curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. They oversimplify implementation. ideas have to be enacted in unique context, actually. They push the concerns for inequality into a bracket, statistically, actually. Poverty is not a statistical, manipulatable background. It's actually a lived existential reality. They fail to examine the effects of the uptake of their own ideas, which I find that sort of ironical, at least. They present educational truths that are a long way from practice and hence undervalue the experiential knowledge of good teachers. And I think in this case, there's a conflation between their database and reality. And hence they make overclaims to no truth rather than more humble claims that reflect the scientific method. Let's move on from them. Maybe just one last slide. Geert Biesta's one of the, I think some of his critiques of what works are about as good as it gets, and perhaps we can have the whole discussion about evidence-based practices focused on technical questions of what works, while forgetting the need for critical inquiry into normative and political questions. I think that's sort of a neat framing of the problem. So this regime asserts a governed mentality or a rationality for governing what goes on in school systems, constitutes truths about the good school leader and good teaching. There's a conflation here of truth and science. Science quite literally is the truth, but then claims to scientific truths hide behind the play of power and all the political decisions that frame up policy for schooling. We can see this going on at the moment on the front page of our papers. So politicians front up the sort of epidemiologists, but then there's a long way between epidemiology and what we should be doing in social policy. So the claims to science, even in that space, are much more confusing than what often gets, the common sense. Quote from Foucault: "We should admit that power produces knowledge, not simply by encouraging it because it serves power or by applying it because it is useful, that power and knowledge directly imply one another, that there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, not only knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations." I guess, as a fundamental Foucaultian proposition, there's a very strong relationship between the way that power works and knowing. Let's put that firmly on the table. Now, in terms of a politics of truth then, engaging in a politics of truth, I think, requires seeing two games of truth that are constantly in play. On the one hand, we're all engaged in discerning what is true and what is false. We're all asserting our truth claims into various knowledge networks. And I think that's the game we normally play. But then behind that game, there's another, one that demands examining how truth itself is authorised, how truth is produced through the establishment of domains in which the practice of true and false can be made at once ordered and pertinent. How it counts as true now gets to hold sway and always in a heterogeneous field of claims. I think if we try and play the first game in the way that truth's organised in our country at the moment, then my side of the ledger, we're disqualified. Actually, we don't get to assert our truth claims because of the way that science is so narrowly defined. Put more simply, we can play the game of true and false and assert truth claims into the contested space, but then into a space that I'm calling as a framer. Or we can rattle the frame, that is to bring the regime of truth, those dominant discourses or the framing of what counts as true and false into view and refuse that with framing. Let's just go and have a look at the sort of key logic of the regime that's in play at the moment. And I've been in education for nearly 45 years now, and I'm thinking about what some of the key policy logics are in this space. And I've come up with 4 actually. So we've had 30 or 40 years of devolution policy. We've got standardisation of varying kinds, and that's intensified in the last few years around IETSL and ICARA. Since Howard, we've intensified parental choice as a key policy logic, and we've also now got what Pat Thompson calls cruel accounting, and we could talk about accountability, performativity, but in the end, it's around the sort of privileging of NAPLAN and high stakes testing. when I go looking for the evidence that any one of those four actually improves student learning, I can't find the evidence. In fact, all the evidence seems to be going in the reverse direction. So we now live in a space in which policymakers are demanding policy evidence for policy and practice, but the key logics of their own policy have no evidence, or the evidence is all in the other direction, actually. And let's just start with devolution. Here's some quotes from Caldwell and Spinks. Brian Caldwell's one of the gurus of neoliberalising devolution policies in the last 30 years, and here's quotes from his latest book. There has been a consistent demand for evidence that self-management leads in cause and effect fashion to improve learning outcomes, and this is understandable despite the unrealistic or inappropriate expectations that have been held for the process. It is sobering to note the consistent findings in early research that there appeared to be few, if any, direct links. A review of research suggests there have been 3 generations of studies, and it's only in the last third that evidence of impact has emerged, and only when certain conditions were fulfilled. Although a balance of centralisation and decentralisation is evident in the above, it is important to note even now that there may be no impact of learning unless purposeful links are made at the school and classroom levels. I think that's sort of fascinating that we've got 20 or 30 years of Caldwell's local school management policies being adopted in OECD countries. In his latest book, he claims that there's little or no evidence that it actually improves learning. Let's have a look at some other sort of data. Here's some data from some colleagues of mine that have been looking at what's going on in schooling in South Australia. And I'm putting this down to one of the effects of devolution policy in our country is what I'm calling narrowing of the normal. I hope this graph makes a bit of sense. It's retention rates and completion rates in the local, year 11 and 12 certificate in South Australia. There's from 2003 to 2012, the blue line sort of an increase in the retention rate to 91%. From 71%, and the completion rates increases slowly, but the completion rate for our school certificate at the end of year 12 is still only 64%. Now, that's its own issue. So on the basis of 20 years of sort of marketising school policies, the numbers of school completions at the end of year 12 are still only slightly more than a half. Now, if we have a look further, in the last 5 to 10 years in South Australia, there's increasing numbers of students who don't fit well into mainstream secondary schooling end up in what's called FLOW, flexible learning opportunities. There's now something like 4,500 or 5,000 year 10 and 11 students that are enrolled in these FLOW programs, which turns out to be about 7% of all secondary school enrolments, or one secondary school and one student in every 14 enrolled in FLOW. So we've had huge numbers of our students pushed out of the sort of mainstream schooling provision into these flexible learning opportunities, which are mostly not taught by trained teachers. Now, when my colleagues look at the success rate of the FLOW programs, it ends up to be 2%. So we've got sort of a radical under success rate of anyone who gets pushed out of the mainstream. So I think a similar argument, maybe 20 years ago, South Australia imported Jeff Spring from Victoria, who was an advocate for Brian Caldwell's position. We had conversations with him early on, and we pointed out that his devolution policies had been tried in New Zealand, and the New Zealand correspondence score was the biggest one in the Southern Hemisphere. So when we implement devolution policies, what happens is increasing numbers of young people get pushed out into programs because the mainstream schooling doesn't want them there. Here's some more evidence of the failure of schooling policy in the country. And this is from the Parliament of Australia website, a few years old, and I'll just read out some sections. The Gonski Review identified several highly concerning trends in educational outcomes of Australian students. It found over the past decade the performance of Australian students had declined at all levels of achievement compared to international benchmarks. In addition to declining performance, the review found that Australia had a significant gap between its highest and lowest performing students, far greater than in many OECD countries. Disturbingly, the review identified an unacceptable link between the low levels of achievement and educational disadvantage, particularly among students from low socioeconomic and Indigenous students. Now, this is not hidden from view. These views are published even on the Parliament of Australia website. Here's the sort of a rough trend of where the student achievement in our country is going. And we could add other things. There's persistent appalling outcomes for Indigenous students. Even the Murdoch press for the last few years reports on the flatlining of NAPLAN. We've got residualising of public schools with some evidence of white flight in Melbourne and Sydney. We've got a crisis of new graduates and too many of them leave before they even get to 5 years. And there's a crisis for aspiring leadership across the sector. So just a few more points here. That the regime that I'm trying to bring into view that informs the reform agenda seems to be Teflon coated. It has a huge machine that drives it and defends it. And today it appears to be immune from any critique. And in response to the policy failure, those driving school policy in Australia assert that we should continue with the same, but just do it harder. That's certainly the argument that we hear from the State Education Department in our jurisdiction. And maybe just a sort of, a parting shot here. It looks like the neoliberal project in education is wobbling, but it's not over yet and not without a fight. A quote from Foucault: there exists at present a problem which is not without importance to the political practice, that of the status of the conditions of existence, functioning, and the institutionalisation of scientific discourses. The regime rightly asserts truth through science, and I'm not arguing that, but that educational policy truths are framed up inside of a narrow, decontextualised, technicist, quantitative version of social science. In the name of science, this regime disqualifies other important essential knowledge. And just quickly, one could argue that we're now involved in what I want to call an archive politics. That is, the truth is now represented in a narrowly defined archive. Let's just quickly move on because I'm running out of time. I think the regime leads two other streams of educational knowledge. There's a huge archive of qualitative studies and it almost completely ignores the practical wisdom of teachers. And we can find arguments and quotes from Foucault about subjugated knowledges in his essays. Just for the benefit, I haven't got enough time for that. But by way of summary thus far, there's now a radical failure of policy for Australian schooling that's driven by a science war that subordinates, subjugates, disqualifies other knowledges that are urgently required if we were to reboot Australian schooling post-pandemic. I guess we are now living in a moment of disruption. The pandemic's caused huge disruption to schooling, and the politics of schooling is now mostly on the front pages of the paper. And there's an opportunity perhaps to sort of reboot the policy, I'm arguing. So the what works regime, I argue, defines the what in terms of narrowly defined outcomes. It pushes teachers towards highly scripted forms of pedagogy, ritualised forms of practice that disavow the unique and singular character of every classroom, and asserts standardised, where am I going here? Asserts standardised versions of the good teacher that informs performance management and promotion, and hence insidiously forces compliance. Perhaps most significantly, the regime here is actually advancing the social stratifying function of schooling and undermining the professional autonomy of teachers, and hence dumbing down our school system from the inside. We can map this back onto theories of society, and I'm arguing that my basic argument is sort of an example of the de-democratising and authoritarian governing that's going on in other spaces. And it shouldn't be surprised that these trends are evident in our social policy space, given the importance of schooling. Now, I'm just trying to segue into the latter part of my paper here. Unfortunately, in Australia today, schooling suffers from a knowledge problem. The major logics of policy have no evidence for improving learning, and there's also a radical disconnect between the official knowledge that's taught in schools and the challenges facing the communities that we all live in and the nation. My analysis of the Australian curriculum suggests that young people living in communities that are being disenfranchised by neoliberal capitalism and the concomitant intensifying of economic inequality one, aren't provided with an account of how neoliberalising capitalism works against their interests, so it's not even on the curriculum, and nor does it provide them with the capabilities for active citizenship, i.e. The wherewithal to do anything about it. And we're supposedly living in a sort of an advanced, knowledge economy. A few quotes here when we go to the sort of citizenship literature. Here's Geert Biester, I think, pegging the problem here. One potential danger of this situation is that schooling is manoeuvred into a position where it contributes to the domestication of the citizen, pinning down of citizens to a particular civic identity, and thus leads to the erosion of more political interpretations of citizenship, and that see the meaning of citizenship as essentially contested. And then from Balibar, the active citizen here is not, on this account, she who by her obedience sanctions the legal order or the system of institutions upon which she has directly or indirectly conferred legitimacy by an explicit or tacit contact, materialised on her position in representative procedures that result in the delegation of power. The active citizen is the rebel, the one who says no, or at least the possibility of doing so. Now, when I go working with teachers, and here's where I'm just moving over to trying to at least very, very briefly sketch out, the two types of knowledges that I think are being ignored by the sort of policy regime. When I work with teachers, they come up with these sorts of problems. How do I provide learning experiences that are intellectually demanding, along with appropriate pedagogy that supports students to be successful? And in the middle of that inquiry is the whole engagement problem that teachers really struggle with. I don't hear that being raised at all, almost in the sort of what works discourses. The naming of the problem by teachers is not the one that what works or government wants to foreground. Another way of putting that is, how do I set hard things and sustain positive relationships? I've heard this for 35 years in classrooms, and it's the question that I struggled with myself in my own teaching. And I suppose in some ways, when you start talking to teachers, the way they name up their problems, they name them up as being dilemmas or paradoxes. It's not a matter of simply ticking boxes. We can go to other places for how we might name up dilemmas. And I think this is sort of a classic quote from Lisa Delpit, which drives the argument that I think is sort of fundamental to an alternative archive of qualitative studies. Quote from Delpit: "I suggest that students must be taught the codes needed to participate fully in the mainstream of life, not by being forced to attend to hollow, inane, decontextualised sub-skills, but rather within the context of meaningful communicative endeavours, that they must be allowed the resource of the teacher's expert knowledge while being helped to acknowledge their own expertness as well." Now that's frames up a completely different inquiry into what we should be doing about defining good teaching. Here's my attempt to think about that, which is now quite old, and my friends will have seen this many times, borrowing from Lusted, who defines pedagogy as basically the relationship between students, teachers, knowledge and identity. If we're sort of serious about the interaction going on here, then what we're trying to do fundamentally is to bring the subject discipline knowledges that we're responsible for into some negotiation with the life world knowledges that students bring to class. So the question here that I want to pose is, how do we understand the life world knowledges that students bring? And there's huge archives of qualitative research here that are organised around many, many concepts, including funds of knowledge, place, local literacies, popular culture, and culturally responsive pedagogy. In which case, the challenge here is to clarify conceptually and further develop this dialectical relation that Delpit and one of our colleagues, Lou Zippen, puts, which is the dialectic between the sort of official knowledge and life world knowledges. And here's some more sort of questions that one could pose that sort of represents the dilemmas that teachers struggle with when they try and do these sorts of things. Again, here's a whole range of keywords that come into this space that sort of represent some angles that are in this sort of archive that's mostly disregarded and disqualified by the what works discourses that are highly privileged in our country. These are all sort of alternatives to the highly scripted models of teaching that our policymakers are demanding at the moment. And we could have spent days and days deconstructing all of these. When I'm looking at some general characteristics of those sort of approaches, then I come up with these dot points. Teachers that operate with these ideas are trying to find creative ways to learn about what's most existential for their students. You know, what's going on in the students' lives that's really, really important to them, and how can I connect with that? Being able to negotiate with students, establishing the classroom as a sort of a researchful place in which students can conduct their own inquiries and produce their own knowledge. Providing space to develop the capacity as uncanny theorists of their own cultures, and providing students with opportunities to take an active role in addressing specific social issues that they've identified. I guess if we're trying to think about ways of understanding the sort of, you know, the pedagogy that's being argued for here, we could use many words, but let's use a jazz concept of improvisation. Sort of an improvisation-based pedagogy, sort of an antidote to pre-scripted pedagogies that are created in complete ignorance of the subjectivities and aptitudes of actual students. And here's a series of dot points, and perhaps we could tease out maybe the third one is practicing some epistemic humility and a willingness to inquire. I'm wanting to argue that good teachers walk into classrooms not full of what they know, but an inquiry sensibility about trying to actually learn more from their students. It's a pedagogy of not knowing, actually. Just to sort of finish off then, as noted, this set of projects can be understood in terms of the knowledge-producing classroom and has to date been framed, and there's so many case studies of sort of what individual teachers get up to. But what I want to argue for as my last move is why can't we scale up these projects into a knowledge-producing school, in which case, quotes from various colleagues here, what we have in mind are schools that become sites for knowledge production, accumulation and dissemination. Schools become known as repositories of knowledge about their local communities, and that includes knowledge about the local environment, history, geography, economy, political economy, blah, blah, blah. Schools would be known as local research centres with capacity building resources for doing research of many kinds. And the school curriculum would transform from providing opportunities for young people to jump through hoops for future learning and work to places where students learn how to learn and conduct their own research that contributes to making their communities better places to live. And I'll stop there.